Hello, everyone. How are you? Super happy to be here. This is my fourth talk at ETHCC, so I think I'm a veteran. And this one is a special talk for me because I can tell you that this talk took years to make. So maybe you have seen the Steve Jobs talk about the commencement speech at Stanford, where he argued that we have some dots that connect in our life. Things we have done that then start to make sense. And I guess I'm starting to get a bit old because those dots are starting to connect, at least in my case. And let me tell you a bit why. I'm from Argentina, a very far away country, well known mostly because of, well, football, meat, but unfortunately also well known because of an economic failure, right? The country used to be, in the early 20th century, economic powerhouse. It was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And after a number of events, over the 20th century, started to lose lots of power, time, and so even compared to other countries that were at the same level when they started. So I started to study economics to try to understand all this, and philosophy. This is where I studied in the University of Buenos Aires. And I specialized in what we call institutional economics, so understanding how institutions affect economic prospects and economic growth of societies and their success. And I read lots of books of political theory, political philosophy, and this is what I want to share with you today, because all of these learnings are starting to become very relevant for some things that we are doing. About me, I'm also, fast forward, founder of Kleros. You know Kleros? Anyone knows Kleros? Yeah, woo, great. Awesome, well, great. Good for the marketing department. Okay, so all of these things started to connect. And Kleros, as you know, is the decentralized arbitration protocol. But the thing now is governance in DAOs. So, and we have seen lots of big failures in governance, MakerDAO, Aragon. And we had ourselves our own drama in governance. I don't know if you know Proof of Humanity and all of the story about this. If you don't, you can read this paper that was written by Jamila and some colleagues from Blockchain Gov about DAO that went wrong at Citizen Ethnography. So the thing is that software developers, they are trained to write software, but not necessarily trained in political philosophy or political theory or politics. So what I want to talk about today is to tell you that many of the governance problems that we have in DAOs are not new. I mean, they have been discussed for centuries by political philosophers and theorists, right? And, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, so hopefully we can take some learnings. I'm going to show you some issues that were important in the history of political theory and try to suggest some learnings for you to dig deeper. I'm not making any suggestion in particular because nobody knows how to build all this, but we can learn a lot from what was done in the past. So first thing is what's cool about democracy, right? I guess not everyone is clear about this. And generally speaking, participation of people in governance is, of course, a source of legitimacy. And also, higher diversity in decision-making tends to lead to better results. So this is not a new idea. Aristotle said this in the 4th century BC. So this is why we should care about democracy. But there are some situations that sometimes tend to move to what I call democratic fetishism, and that we could maybe summarize in hey bros, let's make a DAO and start voting and take the governance in our hands and all good. So we tried this with Proof of Humanity. I mean, we were doing a one-person, one-vote system where everyone could vote, and it didn't work very well. It ended up full of trolls, governance attacks, and lots of different things. And honestly, it didn't work, and it was actually predictable that it would not work. When the founding fathers of the US gathered to make the Constitution, so they had to figure out how to make a governance system for a big democracy. And democracies, as they called them back then, the direct democracies, never worked, as James Madison very well explained. Because there is a problem of knowledge. People don't have the knowledge to vote about everything. Plato, in the 4th century BC, he made this example with people from a ship and the sailors voting for the captain, and maybe they will not vote for the person who is the most qualified. Maybe they will vote for those who are more popular. So he was skeptical of this type of voting. And he was especially wary of the influence that theater had on the citizens of Athens. And he called this governance regime, this mob rule type of regime, like theatocracy. We should ask ourselves if we are not kind of in a situation where this is a tweetocracy, where people get influences from a Twitter, and also if you see the people who hold a lot of voting power in DAOs are basically Twitter celebrities. I mean, this is nothing against Twitter celebrities. I'm just saying that it's not enough to be a celebrity on Twitter to be a good delegate for a DAO. You need lots of more stuff to do. Okay? So this problem is not new. John Stuart Mill, philosopher, 19th century, he was one of the big promoters of universal suffrage. Back then, even to women, in a time that women, of course, could not vote, and it took a long time for them to vote. But he suggested that people with more education or more knowledge should have more votes in society, right? And they should have more votes in the topics that they knew about. And the second big danger of democracies is these factions. Factions meaning when a group of citizens try to protect the interest of their own group instead of the common good of the DAO in this case. And these factions can end up crushing the rights of minorities, right? So the question that we have to answer is how can we make good decisions and avoid the dangers of factions, while at the same time preserving the spirit of popular government to earn legitimacy for DAOs, right? And what the founding fathers of the US did basically was using representation by people. I mean, so people vote for representatives, and they saw representation as a filtering device. So citizens would vote for representatives, and those people, the representatives, would have more information, more knowledge, and they would be in a situation to make better decisions than the citizens themselves. Also, they would have more time. But of course, what happens if the people choose the wrong representatives, right? What happens if they are like seduced by demagogues? So this was a very important problem in all of the history of politics. So how do you recognize a demagogue? There are different definitions, but in general, demagogues present themselves as men or women of the pure or common people, and they are opposed to a corrupt elite. The elite can be defined in different ways. It could be, businessman, I mean, the communist, whatever. But this is one main feature. And the other one is that they tend to create a plebiscitary democracy where the majority decides everything. This idea of let's vote about everything, bros. This is a very fertile ground for demagogues to prosper. How to defend against demagogues? Well, one option, of course, is address their rants with the facts and arguments. And another possibility is to use an institution that the ancient Greek had. This was called ostracism, and every year they met at the assembly and they held a vote where they chose one citizen that they considered too influential, a citizen that they could consider that would become a dictator or a tyrant, and they wrote the name of the citizen in a piece like this one. And then if some citizen had more than X amount of votes, he was expelled, banned from the city for 10 years. So that was the practice of ostracism. I'm not, endorsing it, just saying that this is something that was used in the past to protect cities against demagogues. If you want to learn more, two excellent books about this, Populism, A Very Short Introduction, and the Demagogues Playbook by Eric Posner. Of course, you know Eric Posner is Glenn Wild's co-author in Radical Markets. Okay? Another key idea to defend against demagogues is separation of powers. You know, this idea of different powers having different functions in the governance. I'm not going to get much into this because everyone knows what this is, but it's checks and balances to make sure that there is a rule of law and protection of minorities. I'm just going to recommend 2 talks. The first is a talk I gave at the DevCon Osaka, where this was the first time I presented how a Supreme Court could work in the context of a DAO. And then another talk that was held on this stage by Jimmy Ragosa, a case for separation of powers in DAOs, okay? In this same, look, ETHGC 4. Okay, so one thing we could ask ourselves is how can we implement this idea of separation of powers in our DAO? It's worth mentioning another thing. You know, ancient democracies were based in lotteries. So if we brought an ancient, you know, Plato here and asked him what he thinks of modern republics, he would say that they are like it's a rich man democracy, because they thought that elections tended to only choose citizens who had more time and money to prepare themselves to campaign for their position. So what they thought was better was the use of lotteries or sortition to select the people that they were going to be ruled. So they had this token called Pinakion. It was an ID token, a bronze ID, and the selection process used this piece of stone called Cleroterion that was a random machine, and they put the Pinakion into the random machine, and then someone, official, threw some white and black balls on a slide, and then if you had a white ball, you were chosen for office. If you had a black one, you went home. And this is how these different factions that wanted power were mixed through randomization. And then there was a rotation. It's rotated every year, so it was very hard for a faction to collude and keep the government for themselves, okay? This is a very important idea that ancient democracies had. It was this idea of to rule and to be ruled, this idea of rotation, very fast rotation, and every citizen should have a turn to be in the government. Some books to learn more about sortition. Here you have A Look of the Draw, The Political Evolution of Sortition, and Open Democracy. So another question is, can we use some lotteries into our DAO procedures, okay? Okay, I know what you're thinking, so let's wait for someone to nail this down and say, okay, let them come with a perfect constitution, and now let's just adopt that ourselves. But this is not so easy. So Jeremy Bentham, philosopher from the 19th century as well, late 18th century, he wrote this book where he claimed that basically, since human nature was the same for everyone, constitutions could be the same for every country. Right? And you could have like one constitution which was perfect and then copy-paste this into all of the societies. But there is another vision of this that coming from Montesquieu, that he says that the laws of a society need to be adapted according to its culture and geography. There is no perfect constitution. There is more like a constitution and society fit that one needs to look for. And 1808, Napoleon invades Spain. And what happens, the King of Spain goes to prison, and the American colonies of Spain decide to get the independence. And what they do is they create constitutions. And this is the Argentinian constitution that was basically copied from the US Constitution because that was the success model of the time. And what happened is that the trajectories of the countries were very different, as we saw. How can two countries with basically the same constitution go through so different trajectories of evolution? Well, there must be something more than just constitutions, right? And there could be something about the social and the cultural background that a society needs for a democracy to work. For example, wealth distribution. Tocqueville, French guy who went to America to study the American democracy in the early 19th century, he made this observation about the US, and he published this in this book, Democracy in America, 2 volumes, very long book, but very insightful. He said, America is basically like a middle-class society with lots of equality. But what happened in countries like Argentina or in Latin America was that they were very unequal societies. So this economic inequality coming from, well, different dynamics from the colony ended up that the wealth concentration led to political power concentration, and this ended up with non-functioning governance systems. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, for a republic to work, no citizen needs to be so rich that he can buy another, and not so poor that he is compelled to sell himself. A very good blog post I recommend from Chris Berninsky called The Original Sin is about how when you start a DAO and the token distribution starts by some unequal distribution, then this can result in very bad dynamics in power and in voting that can affect the development of the DAO in the long run. So we need to think when we build our DAO, so how does the wealth distribution affect these political dynamics that will exist there? Can this distribution be improved? I mean, I'm not saying that there should be, a communist revolution and redistribute radically all the tokens, as this was tried, in land reform in many places. But there are some ideas that can at least mitigate the influence of inequalities in wealth into political inequalities. People know Machiavelli because of The Prince, mostly, this manual to get the power. But Machiavelli was basically a Republican, and he had this book called Discourses on Livy, where he proposes how a good republic should work. And he takes inspiration from the constitution of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic had an interesting feature that was called the tribunes of the plebe. The tribunes of the plebe were 10 citizens drawn from the plebeian ranks, people that not haves, people poor, that they had a special veto power for some types of laws. And this was a way to make sure that the elites would not concentrate all of their power. Of course, then Julius Caesar took power and this stopped to work, but that was the idea of the Republic of Rome, and that was what Machiavelli suggested that a republic should have. If you want to learn more about these ideas, you can read Machiavellian Moment and Machiavellian Democracy. This is how to build, republics. And then this could help us see how we can mitigate the power of wealth in our DAO. And one last topic. Good governance comes from good laws or good men. This is one of the key questions in the history of political philosophy. James Madison said that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? And ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is basically, what they say, if you get the government right, then all will be good. So get the right institutions, and then your organization will work. And this is basically how we think about this in the crypto industry. Let's get the mechanism right, and then everything will flow nicely. And of course, rely always on incentives, and don't assume any moral virtue of any agent, right? So, what about morality and political culture? Is there some, place for this? So there is this book called How Democracies Die, that they analyzed the evolution of the US since the Constitution. And what the argument is that, look, when the Founding Fathers left, the Constitution meetings and they were ratified by the states, they were not happy at all. They thought that this would not work. And the American Constitution has lots of flaws, but these authors argue that it still worked because the society has some unwritten rules of mutual toleration. Americans, used to see, at least in the past, the other party as a political adversary, not an enemy to be destroyed. So this was an important, feature there. And also, the party in power would not abuse of the power to try to stay. They would understand that there should be a rotation. So these two features that were more cultural than part of the formal institutions, they argued in this book, were key for the working of the American Republic. When you analyze the Kleros and Democracy Earth drama in Proof of Humanity, this was clearly not the case. There were two factions that were like, they saw each other as enemies. And I mean, in some way, you try to use all of the tools to compete against each other. So this, of course, would not work. If you want to learn more about these ideas of cryptoeconomics and how this affects governance, I recommend this paper by Nathan Schneider, Cryptoeconomics as a Limitation on Governance, and also the response by Vitalik on Nathan Schneider on the limits of cryptoeconomics. Very good read. So questions for us as we build our DAOs: how can we create a culture of civility and collaboration? Can we improve the political culture by education or by religion? You know, many authors from the 18th century especially thought that one of the critical elements for building a society, a cohesive society, was having a civic religion. So religion comes from the word en français relier, in English to tie, and so religion is something that unites people. It doesn't have to be something supernatural, but civic virtue can be inculcated by festival, symbols, ceremonies. So a religion based on moral values that can be basis for the cohesion of a DAO. I guess that's kind of what we are building, right? And we are still here after many ETHECs, so it's working. We have our rituals, we have our ceremonies, so yeah, it's working. So to conclude, DAOs are a great opportunity to rethink governance from first principles, because you don't have to deal with all institutional reforms in states. No, we can basically build this from scratch. We can learn a lot from the history of political ideas because very smart people have thought about this a lot. It's very important that we collaborate with cross-discipline teams. As I said, software developers are not necessarily trained in politics and in political philosophy and political theory. I do recommend that you join, if you're interested in this, Blockchain Gov. It's an association that they do research on DAO governance and they hold conferences. And so this is a great place to go to their weekly or monthly calls and get involved into this community. This is where all of these big ideas are taking shape now. And finally, well, let's experiment. So this is new. So nobody has done this before on the internet, and so we are the first. We are the founding fathers in the US in the 18th century. Well, we are the digital equivalent of them. And just let me leave you with just one thought from Winston Churchill, that the best way to learn is study history, because in history lies all of the secret of statecraft. Thank you very much. Have a question? One question. One question, if you want. Yeah. Yeah, you.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Super interesting to look at the first principles and how they can apply. Obviously, you've spent quite some time researching this, and you talked a lot about historically what worked and what didn't work. What, in your view, is, I don't know, maybe a DAO that's gotten it right, or a constitutional framework that we can apply to a lot of different DAOs?
Can I have another 25 minutes for this question? I mean, I really don't have any answers. I mean, I just wanted to say these are the issues that were discussed in the past, and we are starting to build this. And what I try to just do here is point to these elements, separation of powers, what is the role of political culture, what is the role, maybe should we use sortition? I mean, different elements. Blockchain Gov is actually doing this research, so you should join them or collaborate with them if you want, because this is, I mean, the framework of the future is probably going to come from there. Okay, thank you guys.